welcome to the Stronger After Stroke podcast. I'm your host, Rosa Hart, stroke nurse navigator here at the Norton Neuroscience Institute in Louisville, Kentucky. And today I have a guest who is going to talk to us about a topic most of us know very little about. And so thank you, Sam Schad, for coming to speak to us today.
You're welcome, Rosa. Very excited to be here.
Yeah. So you have a rather unique role that you play for my stroke patients in that you are a disability specialist and you work at a law firm. And so I think a lot of people assume you're an attorney. But
Happens a lot, yes.
Yeah, but you don't have to be an attorney to be a disability specialist, right?
Correct. Pretty much anyone could be a disability specialist. I do have 30 years of experience doing it, been around a fair amount, but working through the law office does give me that extra ability to have that legal backup if it's ever needed. But the system, thankfully, is set up in a way that that helps people understand it without the need for a law degree. So it's a kind system in that regard. Still really complex, but anyone could do what I do. A parent could advocate for someone as a patient, family member, friend, and that's kind of a nice takeaway: is that you don't have to go hire an attorney or even someone like myself to help, but you do want someone who knows what they're doing. That would be a good thing.
Yeah. And so a lot of people have to have this thought process or conversation after a stroke on, is it something I should do? Should I apply for disability benefits if I can't go back to my job, and what the time frame would be? So what would be the first step for someone who's had a stroke to apply for disability benefits?
I think the very first step, the thing that I talk to my clients about as often as I can, is getting a real grasp of where you're at the moment that you're realizing, I can't go back to doing what I did before. And in fact, I might not be able to do much of anything post-stroke. And it's, as part of that first step, kind of figuring out where did I come from post-stroke? Where does it look like I'm going? Does it look like I'm going to regain some function, either physically, mentally, or both, to the point where I might be able to do something? There's a whole bunch of questions right there to answer. But I think the first question is coming to grips with that idea that my function may not be improving to a point where I could sustain not just my job, the thing that I did, but any job on a full-time basis. That's the hardest realization. That's the big step. Yeah.
And is that part of how the Social Security Administration defines disability? How does their definition apply to stroke survivors?
Well, and I told you before we started, I kind of want to spend a moment on this. I want to talk about this particular thing at depth.
So we're going to settle in.
We're going to settle in for a long winter's night in the exciting world of discussing Social Security. To say that Social Security has a definition of disability, most people, when they're explaining that, they tend to default to this idea of that stock definition, an impairment that has lasted or could be expected to last for 1 year or result in death. And that's a pretty hefty statement. It's a pretty hefty definition. It's also not really correct because it's part of a larger analysis. And the way that I want people to be thinking about disability once they've made that decision to go forward is to understand that it's a linear process. It's not just that question. It's not just answering that question. There are 5 steps to the analysis of disability. So the first step is to determine whether or not the person theoretically who is applying, whether or not they're working at the time they make the application for disability. Are they working? Are they working substantially, which the administration has a number for every year? 2024, it was 1470. 2025, it'll be a new number. So if the person is averaging that per month,
1,470
using 2024, they don't get past the first step. So if the person is still working, it is definitely a consideration that has to be made, or you're working part-time. That first step of the analysis is the individual making substantial gainful activity. If they are, they can apply, but they'll be denied because of that first step denial, that first step issue. The second step is actually the definition that we just went through, is that impairment that has lasted or could be expected to last for 1 year and or result in death. So if you get past step one and you're not making 1470, 2024 numbers again, and you make it to the second step applies that analysis. Do you have an impairment that has lasted or could be expected to last for 1 year and or result in death? For stroke, that's a real unknown, right? I mean, different people recover at different rates. Some people are going to recover very, very quickly. Some people very, very slowly. It may take them years. It's an unknown. And unfortunately, in this process, the only people who get to have a crystal ball about whether someone gets better is the federal government. So that it's a hard, right, there's that chuckle that goes along with it. I
Because
almost
the federal
immediately,
government knows the future.
right, it almost immediately feels negative, like someone's out to get you. But that's, that's built into the system. It's built into letting that decision be made by time. So the third step sort of takes into account the possibility that someone's, when it comes to stroke, the possibility that someone's recovery may not be very quick. So the third step of the process is the administration saying, hey, look, we've been at this for decades now, and they have something they call the listings. And the listings are designed to make their analysis quick and effective and to the point for people who are very much in need, and to save the system time, effort, and money at the end of the day. And the listings are something that have been developed over decades, so that when someone with a really bad problem walks through the door, it's very obvious the person is going to meet the rules. It's very obvious the person's not going to be capable of doing substantial gainful activities, step two. And when they do that, they look at, for stroke, some really specific things. And I've got, I don't have the best memory in the world. So
Well, thank you for making sure you give accurate information.
we do. I want everyone to know that we have these things called phones. We can look them up. It's great stuff.
I've heard of those.
So the listings for stroke, or as the administration refers to it, vascular insult to the brain, really helps an individual who's suffering from a couple of things that we know are not going to improve very quickly, and they're going to be long-standing. It's going to take them a while. So the listing for stroke says that if a person is having sensory or motor aphasia, and that has occurred 3 months post-stroke, post-insult.
Or continued.
Continues, right. So as you asked me that question, what's the first thing someone should do? It's thinking about, well, is it the right time? Am I getting better? If you haven't regained full speech capability, or you're having really bad aphasia, problems expressing yourself, problems finding words, problems completing things in more than 1 or 2 words in a sentence after 3 months, well, that's a rule. In the listings, that rule says that person should be granted disability.
That's helpful to know.
It is. I mean, if you can't communicate, kind of hard to do any job.
Yeah.
There are really no jobs in the federal economy that don't require you to work. So the second step is having, and I can put that down now. The second step of the listing, the second possibility in the listing, is having disorganization in 2 limbs, not being able to effectively use a hand and a leg, or effectively being able to use 2 hands, and having this additional issue of not being able to sustain the act of getting up out of a chair, balancing, and or standing in one spot. So if you have aphasia, or you have those problems with disorganization in your appendages, in 2 appendages, you get it. Those are pretty bad folks, right? Probably limited to a wheelchair, probably using a major assistive device to help them move. And then there's a third category in the listings for stroke, which is you have a pretty bad physical problem and also a pretty bad mental problem as well. Problems with memory, problems with organization of thought, problems with maintaining focus. Um, so the listings are very beneficial in that
Yeah.
way. So if you meet a listing, you get it. Bam. If you don't meet a listing, and those rules don't really apply to you, and they're not very, very well founded. The administration goes through an analysis before they go to the fourth and fifth steps of talking about um, basically what the person's still capable of doing. You know, how much can you lift? How far can you walk? How much can you sit? How much can you stand? How long? The Not the problem, but the system decides that, not your doctors, not you in your testimony. It's what does the system think you're capable of doing when the internal doctors to Social Security make their analysis.
Mm.
Once they answer that question, what a person is capable of doing, sitting, standing, walking, pushing, pulling, crouching, bending, stooping, kneeling, crawling, all of those issues, as well as mental issues, they answer two remaining questions in the 5-step process. With those limitations, could you do the job you did before? And if you could do your job from before, not disabled. If you couldn't do your job from before, what else could you do at the 5th step? Is there something else the person could do? So in answer to the question, I told you it was going to be long-winded. I apologize.
No, this is very important information that a lot of people just
Yeah.
don't know where to look.
I've always felt like we should learn this in a government class. Like this whole topic should be covered in a government class. It's why we pay taxes. It's
Oh, you mean in like elementary school?
actually in school. Why aren't we taking this in high school?
Oh, in high school.
There should be curriculum for this. Anyway, I'll put my soapbox away. So when the administration, when you're talking about a definition, it's really close-minded to just look at that second step, an impairment that has lasted or could be expected to last a year. And I know you have a bunch of other questions. So as we go through those, I think it will make more sense if we have those 5 steps outlined for us and we know where we're going. So there we go. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
What's next? What's next?
So a big thing that impacts people's lives and their quality of life, especially after a stroke, is the question, am I going to be able to drive again?
Right.
Maybe they don't necessarily have any deficits, but they're nervous
Mhm.
and they are told, wait a month or so before you drive. Well, then some people have more obvious ways that their driving is impacted. Their reaction time is not there, or like you were talking about, maybe their arm doesn't work, or their
Right.
foot that they would use on the pedal, right?
Right. Reaction
So
time.
yeah, and then so what would be the main factors that determine whether a stroke survivor qualifies for benefits related to driving, or is driving even a consideration for disability?
Right. It's not.
Okay.
It's not. So there's like in 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 preparing today,
Mhm.
it makes you stop and think about things that automatically get it. Where does that fall? Where does that question fall? Well, it's got to fall into the process. It's got to fall into those 5 steps. There's no rule along that step, along that linear process that says, oh, a person can't drive, disabled. Now, if a person can't drive, they do still have to get to work. And the federal government feels that it's public transportation or family members, wherever you might live, whether you're rural, whether you're urban, there's another way for you to get there. We're not going to waste our resources as an entity determining that. We're only going to worry about 9 to 5. And that 9 to 5 period is that individual capable of maintaining work, whatever it may
Once
be,
they're at their
once
destination
they're
to do
there.
the work.
But there is some consideration, and if the person can't use public transportation, if their limitations don't allow them to do public transportation, whether it's physical, say for instance, even if you were using disability transportation, and this might jump ahead on some things, but If you can't access that service, either it's not provided in your local area, there's a little wiggle room and regulation on that. There's a point to make an argument in support of yourself. Or if you can use public transportation, but you need help, maybe you have bad PBA, maybe you have bad pseudobulbar effect
Mhm.
alteration of the way you present to the rest of the world. How's the rest of the world going to react to you when perhaps your behavior is not what the world considers normal?
Because when people experience pseudobulbar effect, they may be laughing when it's inappropriate or
Right?
crying when it's inappropriate,
Sure.
and that can cause a lot of distress for people around who don't
Right.
understand what's going on as well.
I actually address this in hearings with judges
Really?
pretty often. This is a big topic that comes up.
Oh,
What about that ability to navigate the real world with these residual problems you have post stroke? So that's an interesting one. I could keep going
what
on
does
with that.
that conversation sound like when you're explaining it to a judge who may have no frame of reference for what you're talking about?
Well, in the disability process, once you're in front of a judge, there's an additional expert the administration will have in the hearing, and that person is called a vocational witness, a vocational expert, a VE, as it's called. And thankfully, there are some things that we don't just leave entirely to the government. We do employ experts in this process
Okay.
who know what the vocational impact of losing control of your emotions or displaying inappropriate emotions or not being able to sustain that ability to focus, sustain an ability to deal with people, which is something that I encounter a great deal with my clients. Um, just your ability to tolerate the rest of the world. For 10 minutes, great. 3 hours, that's a bigger deal. That's a harder thing to do. So that moment is very much not so much with a judge. It's positing kind of hypothetical questions based upon what you've talked to about your problems with your doctor, and we're going to get to that, I think. What that moment sounds like is Mr. or Mrs. Vocational Expert, what would happen if you had a hypothetical individual who couldn't sustain the ability to interact with other people for a full day's work. They would need extra breaks. They may, on occasion, inappropriately express themselves and probably not even realize that that's what's happening. How is that going to affect their ability to A, do what they did before, and to B, maybe something else? So it is an interesting moment. I could talk about that
Well, it's
for
good to
a
know
half
that
hour.
there are
Yeah,
more experts that they bring into it. It's not just maybe in this case you, your client, and a judge, but there are
right.
other people that are part of the conversation as well,
Mhm.
making sure it's covered from all these different angles. Let's see. Uh, I think you already covered the severity of the type of stroke, right?
No,
No?
well, kind of. When we talked about the listings, um,
Yeah.
they don't
So,
really look at what kind of stroke that you had. You had a
yeah,
stroke, and in fact, they call it vascular insult to the brain,
as they should.
as they should, which is exactly what it is. But there is no further classification for the type of stroke, just what the stroke did to you.
So it doesn't matter if it was ischemic or hemorrhagic, just the amount of damage that was done and the amount of deficits that were left.
Right. What's the remaining functional ability
Mhm.
is the real nexus.
So, are there any specific functional limitations or symptoms that are commonly associated with stroke specifically that increase the likelihood of approval?
Yeah. So again, we've got those 5 steps. We've got this process that we're thinking about in terms of if the person doesn't meet the listings, then the remaining analysis is what's the person still capable of doing? And with that information in hand, could they do what they did before? And if not that, then something else. So there's a theme that comes out in disability law pretty often, which is the one-armed worker and the ability to, and this kind of does fall back to the listings, but if you get to a hearing, you usually don't talk about the listings much. You do, but there's a greater focus on functional ability.
Hmm.
So if you have someone who had a right-sided stroke affecting the right side, and they were right-handed dominant, and they can't use that hand, or that hand has drawn up, and if they were doing clerical work, say a desk job, um, that's really going to impact their ability to do that kind of work. So you win at the fourth step, can't do what you did before. And at the fifth step, could you do something else? Well, if you also have a balance problem and you need a cane to get from point A to point B, um, you can't really carry because you have a cane in one hand, and you can't really carry much weight because your other arm might not be good for much of anything. It may be drawn up, it may be spastic, it may be pulled in, or it just may not have much strength. And that's such a huge and really regular symptom, is that lack of strength. Um, so I think that kind of answers that. Is that just having one hand
Hmm.
doesn't
And
mean you
whether or
can
not it's
still
your
work.
dominant hand, and I'm glad you included the element of balance.
Hmm.
Balance challenges are
It's
very
huge.
common with stroke, and
Yeah.
if they have to use their other arm to
Hmm.
balance in some way, then they're not able to carry.
And let's talk about that, kind of, flesh that out in terms of not just the person. You know, I have a clerical job.
Hmm.
The vast majority of my day is spent at a desk, and I realize the rest of the world doesn't live like that. Thankfully, so does the government. Um, so they break work down into different categories. So you've got into weight categories, exertional categories. So when they're asking that question of what else could you do, you've got basically 5 other categories of work. You've got very heavy work, medium work, light work, and sedentary work. Most people who have a stroke are not going to be able to do those, sorry, top 3.
Hmm.
Very heavy, and medium work.
Hmm.
It's just too much. The body's too affected. So it really limits you to light work and sedentary work. Really, you wind up at sedentary work because you can't carry if you need an assistive device for balance.
Hmm.
So light work really requires you to carry. So if you were, say, doing some kind of a um, more factory work, you were doing any kind of work that involved you to be on your feet all day, you may have even had very significant issues, very significant responsibilities. You could have been supervisory. You could have had um, a requirement to do testing, or to pull products off the line, whatever that environment may be. But if you can't navigate without a cane for balance, and you're also required to carry, you just can't do that work anymore. So this is kind of how it all ties together.
Yeah, and I
Sorry.
can see how it might be really helpful to have someone like you around to explain these things, because it's hard for people to put all this into words necessarily.
It is. It is. I'm a bit of um, a whisperer. The things that, hey, Mrs. Smith, I'm so sorry.
Mhm.
You should be sharing with your doctor. If you can't do X, your doctor needs to know that. They need to understand that while you walked in today, today was it was a good day. Tomorrow might not be so good. So
Yeah. So, what challenges or obstacles do stroke survivors typically face when applying for disability? Since stroke happens acutely, all of a
mhm,
sudden, it's not usually like a chronic, gradual onset where you have years of preparation and documentation.
mhm,
They were at a job making above that income, and then they have a stroke.
right.
And so they have a record of making an income that month that exceeds that, for what was it, the first step?
N- right. Um, it
So
just roll.
does that make it more
No,
complicated at all?
no, that
No.
doesn't make it that much more complicated. You just go to the next month.
Okay.
Obviously, by the next month, the person isn't working. So,
So they don't have to wait like a certain number of months to start the application process?
no, you could apply the day after your stroke.
Okay.
It's probably better to
Mhm.
wait a bit to see how you recuperate.
Hopefully you get really better
Right. Well, a
really
lot of
fast.
people do, which is
Yes.
fantastic. But if you don't, um, then it goes back to that very first question you asked me, which is, what's that first step? The first step is trying to figure out where you're at and where you're gonna be. Did that answer that question?
Well, is there any challenge to
Okay.
applying for a stroke survivor versus someone with a more chronic
Right, right.
onset
So
disability?
the challenge is time. The challenge is not I- is the challenge is the thing that is obviously the most challenging to the individual who is affected, which is
Hmm.
not knowing where you're gonna be, not knowing where um, you max out. How good am I gonna get? How how much is it gonna come back? How much is my speech gonna come back? How
And you don't want to
much?
stop working on it and give up.
Right,
Definitely.
right. The big challenges are a lack of care, which is, you didn't prompt me to say that,
No,
even though we're here at the Norton. The big challenge is not getting the care that you need. The hugest challenge that I deal with is going home after stroke and not doing physical therapy and not doing the therapies that you would need to do to try to get as good as you can as quickly as you can. So the challenges that I experience in representation are sort of the challenges that I would imagine you as a practitioner experience day to day, getting that individual back in to get the care that they need. So care, care is the biggest challenge.
especially rehabilitation therapy.
Yeah,
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 exactly.
yeah.
And so then how do you as a disability specialist help stroke survivors to navigate the application process?
So when I come here to Norton, my whole goal is to answer questions just like we're doing today.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Make sure that the individual who's thinking about applying knows how this system works and knows what they're going to need to have at their disposal when they go down the road of applying for disability, and um, preparing them for what that road ahead looks like. Um, so I think that in the big scheme of things, um, that preparation is absolutely key. Totally lost track of your question.
That's okay.
Did I get
No,
that?
that I
Okay.
think I've taken your word for it that that's what you
Right.
do.
Preparation. So I can get down into the nitty gritty as into what a representative does, but that representative who's helping you, they should be that person that's helping you navigate. Well, this is what I'm dealing with on a daily basis. But when we look at your medical record, that isn't what comes out. It all comes back to being, and I think anybody watching your podcast would know this, is that you and or a caregiver, you need to be your own best advocate.
Mhm.
You have to be the one saying, I can't do X anymore, or this is a problem now. It wasn't a problem for me before. And getting with your medical practitioners to find out what the next step is going to be.
Yeah, because when you're in your doctor's office for your not 30, 90-day follow-up, whatever it is,
Mhm.
they don't know necessarily what your normal was at home unless you tell them, and all they know about it
Mm.
is what you tell them. So
Right,
they're not going to be able to read your mind or assume things that you might take for granted. And so it's helpful to talk these things out and compare, okay, what was I able to do before that I'm not able to do now? And then volunteer that information instead of waiting for someone to ask you or waiting for someone to assume that you're going to need it because they just can't make
right.
it up out of thin air.
And that um, I do feel that in cases of stroke, when someone is thinking about applying for disability, I'm not making this statement simply to advocate for the legal profession, but this is one of those impairments that having help is almost essential, because part of that whole issue of what we just discussed is being able to communicate what deficit is, and being able to communicate what the rest of the world might, what your doctors might be seeing and kind of taking for granted because that's something that just happens with stroke. You know, I recognize that in records very often with medical practitioners. Oh, this person had a stroke. That's why they're walking X, Y, Z, or their mental function is off a little bit. All of those things, though, need to come out upon exam. They need to be part of that exam, and that's, I think, might dovetail into a question to talk about, which is what your doctors can do. Um,
What can they do?
what can they do? Well, be vigilant. Listen to what the patient is saying. When that patient says that they are tired and fatigued and can't really get through the day, gotta spend some time talking about that from a clinical perspective. Um, that becomes a huge symptom for us in disability, the fatigue of just being able to get through the day. And I think sometimes post-stroke, that can take years for some
So,
people to
what
get back.
questions in this exam would be helpful for you if the providers asked and documented the answers?
An ability to get through the day without having to take excessive stops or breaks.
Their normal day.
A normal day, just activities of daily living, really taking a focus on what that individual's day-to-day life looks at. And I think, uh, boy, there's a powerful couple of words. I think without my medical degree, I think that that information presented over time, going through that, really does help paint a picture about where someone's functional impairment really lies. Um, so having those frank conversations with your doctor is super, super important. Having a discussion about strength and balance, again, just the basics, which you deal with all the time.
Balance is important.
Right. Um, so let's dovetail balance back into driving and the importance of balance in driving. So, how does driving, how is balance, how does that affect the act of driving? Well, a lot. It affects it a ton. Turn your head too fast,
And you get dizzy.
and you get dizzy. Have to, maybe there was a visual impairment that came with the stroke that requires you to focus more with one eye, so it causes you to turn your head, which then
Makes you
so
dizzy.
it makes everything,
Mhm.
yeah. So things that the patient may not think are that big of a deal because they're going to see the specialist in stroke, um, and they know what they're talking about. So everything's going to, no, you can't gloss those impairments over. So it's a hard road for a practitioner to travel because there's a lot of listening that has to go on, typically in a pretty limited amount of time.
Mhm.
Um, so take notes. In this day and age, what
And they can use my chart message.
you can use my chart messages. It's a great way to pass along information pre or post appointment or in between appointments to show how you're doing without wasting that clinical time that you have in front of your doctor.
Exactly. So, what tips would you have for someone to ensure their claim is processed as quickly and efficiently as possible?
Get a representative.
Okay.
That would be the quickest and easiest way to do it.
Uh-huh.
There is then someone whose job it is, and they have a legal responsibility to do that. If you're doing it on your own, so that is that it's not a plug for the legal industry. It's just what we're here to do. We're designed to do that. But to be well prepared is absolutely the best thing you can be. Always have somebody with you at those doctor's appointments.
You don't
Always
mean a legal representative, like a family member,
right,
just
right,
to witness what's going on,
right,
help
and
remember what the doctor says,
fill in
or bring,
gaps.
yeah, fill in the gaps. Like if there are things that you need to share with the doctor and you're not going to remember it because
Right,
you get to tense about going and you forget what you were going to say.
So in terms of preparation, let me tell you something you don't have to worry about.
What's
You don't
that?
have to worry about getting the evidence. Social Security, if you don't use someone like me, Social Security is going to get it. You might have to do a little bit of prodding because once you've applied for Social Security, you are going to have a case adjudicator, someone who is helping process that case for the administration, taking direction from Social Security's internal doctors, taking direction from you, helping you fill out forms, things like that. But don't concern yourself too much, at least here in Kentucky. We have a good what's called disability determination service here in Kentucky. They're very thorough. On a national level, the federal government, after you've signed a release, they can do what's called a HIT medical records request, which lets them get records really with just a couple clicks of a button from larger hospital systems. Smaller providers, a little more difficult, a little more time consuming.
Well, it's a matter of who has the software, right?
Right. But they're all trained in that. So, digressing from that just a little bit, if your neuro care is provided by someone who's not in a larger hospital system, and you have a conversation with Social Security one day, and they say, we haven't gotten records from so-and-so yet, make that a focus. You've got to get to the doctor and get those records at that point. Probably 19 times out of 20, you're not going to have to worry about that. They actually do a really good job. So making sure that Social Security gets the information that they need, that's huge. The other huge one that, gosh, if I could bottle this message, maybe I should just do a billboard somewhere. The forms that Social Security sends people to fill out, you always get those, almost always get those late. They'll say they want them back by a certain date, but by the time you get it, that date has passed.
The person who wants to apply
Right.
receives the forms that need to be filled out
right. Forms
after
from
the
Social
date at which
Security.
they were supposed to be turned in.
Right.
Well, then what do?
You call the person adjudicating the claim and say, hey, I just got these. Can you give me extra time? Yes, they give you extra time.
Okay.
They always give you extra
Okay.
time.
So no need to panic.
No need to panic.
Okay.
No need to panic.
That's good to know.
And those forms, any form that Social Security sends you, this is not the IRS. It is a complex system, but the forms that Social Security sends people to complete about daily function, fatigue, strength, headaches, vision problems, seizure, which also come along with stroke as well. They are designed to be filled out by everyone in this economy. They are not designed to trick you. And that's something I haven't said yet that it probably should have led this entire conversation with, the system isn't out to get you.
Really?
The government is not out to deny. What the system is out to do is make accurate, verifiable, reproducible decisions, which sounds a lot like the medical industry.
Yeah.
Everybody's just trying to do the best thing. It's difficult to guide through that system sometimes, and there is a human element. People have good days, people have bad days, but overall, the system isn't trying to fill a quota of how many people get it and how many people don't get it. It's just not designed like that. It's designed to help as many people as it can without error as often as possible. So, interesting.
Well, I hadn't heard that before, so thank you for sharing that. That's encouraging just to know it's not rigged against you and they're not trying to say no because
it doesn't
maybe
feel
they
like
approved
that.
too many.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't feel like that.
Especially if you receive the application too late to turn it in. They can feel like they don't want you to fill it out.
Right.
But you're saying that's an administrative
Well, the
issue.
application, that's a whole different ball of wax.
Yeah.
So when I'm talking about forms, it's the forms you get once the thing has started. Getting the application filed, that's really important. That you really do have to make sure you get those forms in there.
To start, yeah. What are some common reasons why disability claims for stroke survivors would get denied?
Going back to that second step. an impairment that has lasted or could be expected to last for a year. It's just an unknown. And it's
Getting
not
someone to write that this is the prognosis?
only Social Security has a crystal ball. They're the
So
only ones that get to make that determination.
so you don't need a physician to write down that they expect this
It
to
wouldn't
last.
hurt. It wouldn't hurt. It
Okay.
wouldn't. It definitely doesn't hurt. Um, it would be nice if your practitioner could do that for you. And obviously, someone who is confined to a bed and is not walking and is so after several months, there's a likelihood that that individual wouldn't be able to get back to it. Well, in that situation, you just go to, you're at the third step. Does the listing apply? Yeah, the listing applies. They can't
Okay.
communicate or they're having problems with that mobility.
So then what steps should someone take if their claim is denied?
Appeal quickly. Most of the time, you want to get on that just to keep the process going. This system is, somebody's going to think I have, I'm going to get my pom poms out and start cheering for Social Security. That's not going to happen. But the system is improved.
Okay.
Customer service is better than it was many years ago. These horror stories, and they are still there, of people waiting years and years and years and years for a benefit. Those still exist, but not in the numbers that we experienced them, you know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. The average lifespan of a case in our region, the Norton region,
Mhm.
is probably 9 to 15 months most of the time.
Which
Um,
can feel like an eternity,
Absolutely,
especially if you
absolutely.
have no income coming in.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, I suppose
But
if
there is an appeal.
there is an appeal, you
Make
got
sure
to
you
get
appeal
back
it
to that as
as
quickly
soon.
as you
Okay.
can. And if you get denied once, coming back to another fallacy, everybody does not get denied the first time they apply.
They
It,
don't have some kind of technology that automatically denies it to just see if you
no,
give up?
they actually spend more time looking at it in their first analysis than they do at the second. That's a bit of a raging overstatement on my part. But when Social Security looks at the case for the first time, generally 1 out of 3 people get it,
Okay.
which is a far cry from that myth of everybody gets denied the first time. So, if you do apply, that first step becomes very important to make sure that you are getting information to the Social Security Administration, um, and they can make that decision. So
If anything, would you say it's helpful if there's a denial to just see, okay, why was it denied? And then address that issue if it was a lack of documentation or something
sometimes you
like
can
that?
do that. Sometimes we're successful in identifying that. The problem is until you've been denied twice in this process, people like me, representatives, we don't get access to the internal logic. We don't have access to everything that Social Security's internal analysis talked about.
It's just a mystery.
It's not entirely a mystery. Your denial that you get from Social Security does tell you, hey, we found you not disabled because we think that even though you can't do what you've done before, we think there's something else that you can do.
Okay.
So right then and there, you kind of know what the
It
problem is
gives
going to
you
be.
something to address.
It does. They are not going to go and look at every piece of evidence with a fresh lens.
Okay.
They're generally looking for things that have changed since the initial analysis was made, or was there a fundamental problem with that initial analysis, um, which is generally about the time you go look for help. So if you've done it on your own and you thought about taking that first swing, if you do get denied, at that point you probably do want some representation. That's the safe thing to do.
How do disability benefits interact with returning to work for stroke survivors?
Okay. Um, Social Security has some really fantastic rules for returning to work. They are very helpful. They really make the process of someone getting back into the workforce a viable option. So just because you filed and you've gotten it doesn't mean you can't come off of it. Um, so these rules that Social Security has are for individuals who are receiving benefits that are not supplemental security income. I'll not bore everyone with all of the other acronyms. Let's just say that if you're on a benefit that isn't supplemental security income, these rules would apply. And these rules are called the trial work period. They are a lovely set of rules that let people really make an honest to God attempt to get back into the workforce. So the trial work period is a 9-month period of time in which someone can try to work to see if they're able to get back to work. In any month in which an individual makes greater than $1,110 gross pre-tax, that will be considered a month of work in the trial work period.
And is that subtracted from their disability check?
No, you
Because
get it.
I know that's a concern.
You get to
Yeah.
double dip. You get
Nice.
not. It is. Why do you get to double dip? You're in the club. The federal government used resources to find and determine that you were disabled. You were granted the benefit, and a disabled person is not doesn't have the same issues or doesn't have the same abilities as the rest of the working population, right? Because they're disabled.
Hmm.
So the federal government knows that. You get a leg up. We found you disabled. Here's your leg up. You get to work and you get to get your check for up to 9 months at that 1110 level for 24. It'll be a different number in 25. And in the ensuing years, just look up trial work period. So the trial work period months don't have to be consecutive. So you could do 2 months and then have, let's call it a relapse or a bad month. Things just didn't go well.
Yeah.
But then you recuperate and you're back at it and you get back out there and you're able to do another 7 months. And all of those 9 total months of work, you did get your check and you also got your check from work. Fantastic, right? At the end of 9 months, though, the administration isn't going to utilize any more resources internally. You're not disabled. It goes back to sort of that step one analysis that we talked about. The person's working, so they're not disabled anymore. Still, the system will grant 2 more months of benefits because it's a kind and benevolent system. After that, you're no longer disabled. There's a whole bunch more rules. I could keep going on this if you want me to. But basically, the next greatest benefits that come along with a successful return to work are that if you were receiving Medicare, which we haven't really talked much about, but if you had been disabled for 2 years,
Hmm.
you would have gotten Medicare
Oh, okay.
And-
At any age?
at any age.
Oh, okay.
Once you get back to work, you get to keep your Medicare for
Up to 9 months?
2 years.
2 years?
They made you wait 2 years on the front end to get
Okay.
it so that they could incentivize you on the back end with 2 years of insurance coverage. So you can go into that new job and not worry about insurance coverage. Yeah, you'll have to worry about your Medicare premium, but that's a tremendous benefit to someone returning to work. Well, I've got to stay at that job. I've got to kill myself to do that job so I can keep my insurance because I don't have insurance anymore. Or I've got to take a job that's perhaps physically impossible for me to do, but I'm going to go do it anyway.
Even
So,
if it's unsafe?
yeah, it's a really good benefit. So
Wow.
that's how work and disability dovetail together. Folks on SSI have a kind of a harder road to hoe to get back into the workforce. It's definitely more difficult.
So what role, let's see, let's not go there because we already asked you about that. Hmm. So what would be some success stories that you might have from working with stroke survivors who are going through the process of applying for disability?
They would almost all the big ones that come to my mind after 30 years and, a lot of people, at this point, it would be those return to work stories. That is the success story. That's the ideal for what this system was created to do. It was created to help people in a period of time in which their entire world was upside down, and give them that leg up so that eventually they did have the resources they needed to survive, and they were able to get back into the workforce. Um, the success stories in my practice on a day-to-day basis are those folks who call and they don't. I haven't talked to them in a while, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years. But the success story is talking to someone who wants to just come in and have a consult of how the trial work period works because they're really ready to get out there and try.
Yeah.
And it's the thing that I feel that I can get passionate about in my job of a system that was designed to help and does help very, very well when it works and when your client has been able to prove their case. Um, it would not be real good for me to give individual stories,
Hmm.
but let's just say there's a lot of them, and a lot of people do go back to work, and that's a really uplifting part of my day when I get to take that call.
Oh, definitely. And, on the Stronger After Stroke podcast, we
Right.
definitely want to emphasize that once you
Mhm.
have a stroke, thanks to neuroplasticity, you can continue to get
Right.
better after that initial period, even years later. So that's really encouraging to hear that you're seeing that on your side
Yeah.
too.
And let me throw one other point in about the neuroplasticity and the idea of getting back to work. It's so hard for all of us as we've done in our working careers. We build up these skill sets. We build up, um, a livelihood and a way of living. Plasticity in life is not just for the brain. It's not just for, getting better. We have to be flexible sometimes. Maybe we can go do something else. Maybe we can't do what we did before, but maybe you can get back to doing something else. And I think you've probably had some podcasts or will have some podcasts with folk rehab services.
I would love to.
That would be a really good topic. That's kind of the next step. I think
Yeah.
once you've improved is I can't do what I did before, but maybe I can get out there and do something new. And there are services that help with that as well.
Yeah. To
So
identify those new
yeah,
paths.
what are the
Yeah.
options?
So thank you for identifying that as an additional
Cool.
resource that
You're
people
welcome.
can look into. If you don't know what vocational rehab is, definitely look that up in your state and see what might be available to you. And then, Sam, thank you so much for taking your time out of your
Thank you.
day to
Thank
come and
you.
share this information for free to our listeners,
My pleasure.
so that wherever you're listening in the United States, hopefully you can benefit from understanding
Mhm.
the application process for disability services. So,
Thank you, Nurse
okay.
Rosa.
All right.
All right.
And if you have enjoyed this episode of the Stronger After Stroke podcast, I would love it if you could leave me a comment wherever you are listening. Let me know what was helpful for you, as well as any new topics you would like us to cover to answer other questions you have. So make sure you're following and subscribed on whatever platform you're using. And I'll see you in the next episode.